and do good work. I think dialogue is very, very important between secular and religious voices. I also want to say that often when I give a talk, people talk about it kind of sinking in a little bit. I'm a very non-linear person, so I'm not going to speak chronologically. I'm not going to ask that you do A, B, and C. It's going to kind of sink in after about 72 hours, and you're going to pick up on little parts, because that's sort of how I work. My talks are sort of a piece of artwork a little bit. True to comedian and storytelling extraordinaire Hannah Gadsby, as she would say, I'm here to create tension. And there's nothing that creates tension more than truth. That's why I've been committed since watching her routines to really stay true to the right words, the most honest words I can find, and not cover up anymore. Some of the things I have to say will be very difficult to take in. So there's just a bit of a warning. I tend to be a walking trigger warning. I'm talking today about listening to stories of horror and being able to withstand them enough to let them be as they are, and then to help pass them on as a method of healing in society. I've been observing once again in how hard it is for people to listen to stories of truth from the marginalized. The listeners, usually white people, have no reference for horror. We can't sit in horror. We can't cope with its meaning because there isn't one. And most of all, we hate that it involves our complacency. We don't want to hear that. We aren't patient enough either. If you're not going to get to the solution or even to the juicy bits in enough time, then why bother even listening to the story? If you had to listen to 8 minutes and 46 seconds as told to you the death of George Floyd, would you be able to withstand it? Or can you only stand the edited video? Also with the Me Too movement, when I gave a talk about how our shortening plot lines and rush to the end is a very dangerous thing to have for the discipline of listening to tales of horror. We are once again seeing a culture cover up the necessary work by shuffling around legal definitions, promising to hire more people of color, changing flags and statues, etc., etc. Yes, do all those things are good. Keep going. But don't think for a second that by changing an external patriarchal linear world as defined in legal terms, which are also hierarchical, patriarchal, and often outdated, is going to have any sway in our internal mechanisms. We don't share the same memories, so how can we possibly heal? Stories take time to be told. They take time to work. They take time to sink in. Personal stories have a beginning and middle, but often no end. No resolution. And so this is where we find ourselves in uncharted territory. Our myths create grand endings. Endings we've learned to adapt to and expect to see in our own lives. Endings that seep into our psyche and often get passed down the generations. The resurrection as a story, as a belief, and as an absorbed moral myth has been used as a tool to speed up the process of healing, to get often artificially to something that blots out the whole memory of something horrific. There is impatience in the resurrection. It's sort of the microwave of healing. You know, you've got 3 days and all it takes, and boom, you've got reversal of death, freedom from sacrifice, and eternal life. 3 days is all it is, zapped and cooked. What a deal. Wow. An entire Western culture weaned on the idea that no matter how bad it gets, something will come along very soon to make it all go away and change it back to the way it was, or even make it better. Shinier for sure, because now everybody has halos. The resurrection was the original spiritual bypass. Its sudden timing, the key to its potential for damage. The warning of spiritual bypassing is asking us to take our time, stay a little. I call this sitting in your Saturday, the place after the day, after the Good Friday of horror, where you have to learn to live with it. You don't know what's coming. You don't have to believe in the Christian myth to be influenced by the structure of its timing. You don't have to be mad at me for using a Christian metaphor. It's a literary tool, And it's all about how we measure our timing when it comes to coping. I think there's no better way to show this. The proof that we believe this, even if we don't believe in the myth itself, is in our inability to cope. We tend to avoid the things we have no answer for. And then even worse, we invent happy endings for the things that are unsolved or unacknowledged. Our push for the ending skips the story entirely. The resurrection's pompous joy inserts itself as a rude gesture rather than a long-awaited relief. There is nothing long about only one day of despair. This is an impossible place to put ourselves if we are going to heal. The resurrection cannot eclipse the truth. And for many of us, especially the marginalized, the truth remains in that Saturday. The personal story, the one people don't want to hear, the one when spoken enough, when embedded into the society as a collective psyche, has the power to change a society. When you hear these stories, something happens to you. You will recognize that sides are not places you can stay. You will be conflicted because your myth training wants you to find an end, to fix it, a place to go where you can feel good about where you stand on the issues, a place to stake your claim and know which character you would have played in the story. The good one, right? Maybe. I have this incredible friend, Alexis Dixon. He is a world-class mediator and incredible conversationalist, and my dream is for the entire world to have a conversation with Alexis Dixon. A word he uses over and over again to describe the things we can't settle on, or the things that stand in the middle, or the things that tend to run back and forth and have no definite space, is the word texture. It does not necessarily wipe out the linear plane, nor does it allow anything to be a straightaway. It can hold a place of two binary thoughts and attitudes, yet keep the middle just as robust. It's a place that's bumpy and yet stable. In the world of workouts and personal training, a world that I'm familiar with, I know that working concrete exercises on an unstable surface will make you fitter faster more than anything else. Our bodies even know the importance of texture. In November of 2018, I was at the Metro Toronto Convention Centre, finishing up my first talk at the Parliament of World Religions. And a woman came up to me and asked when I would be speaking again over the weekend. I presume she liked my talk. She wanted to see me again. Great, I have a fan. I said I was speaking in a couple hours about being the daughter of a school shooter. And her eyes got big and she reeled back and grabbed her chest, which happens quite often when people meet me and know my story. It's not unusual. And she kind of put up her hands and she said, "Oh no. Oh, no, I can't listen to that. I didn't know that was you in the program. I didn't know. I can't think about that. I can't do that." And she shook her hands in the air as if to flutter away the thought away from her, as if she could create a wind strong enough to dry up all the blood of the dead American students in this country. This interaction disturbed me greatly. It made me understand once again that I don't have the luxury of the flutter walk and distance. I cannot back up from my history. It also meant that if she was not to hear what I had to say, that perhaps then nothing would change in this country. My existence is a reminder of something extremely uncomfortable in American society. After my school shooting talk was done, a young woman came up to me and she got very close. And often I'm always frightened if this is the moment that I get shot. And as my heart was beating and I was a little nervous, she leaned in very close and then much closer, to the point where I could feel her hair right on the side of my face. I could see that there were tears in her eyes. It's not unusual for people to hug me crying after my talk, but it was her proximity to my face that I knew something about this was very different. She wanted to say something that no one else around us could hear. And then I realized, us secret keepers, we know each other's language very well, and so I obliged. She leaned in and she said, "I want to thank you for explaining the love daughters have for the fathers who do bad things. My father was a pedophile. I cared for him for the last 3 years of his life until he died. Thank you for showing me I did the right thing and that it was okay to love him. Tears began to fall for me too then. I leaned in, we held each other. And there broke in the space. That space of thinness and a vastness of no definite answer, something echoey and truthful, and a place of, well, what the hell do you say to something like that? And quite honestly, there is nothing to say. I would never expect anyone to come up to me after a talk and say, thank you for helping me love murderers. Or now I can see we can let everybody out of jail and it will be okay since it all worked out for your dad. I hope those are never the messages anyone gets from me. Just as I inherently understood that her love for her father in no way sanctioned pedophilia. This was a kind of space that only she and I could occupy, this place of understanding, but not really being able to name it. It was a place of love, but also of extreme caution. Where our stories connected is a place few people ever have to think about. But there it was, being held by both of us. Honesty. A true honest feeling is rarely singular. Honest means to be free of deceit. It means you hide nothing. It is never meant to be just one thing. She felt she had just been given permission to honor the texture that existed in her space. I knew in that moment that that words she spoke to me had only been spoken to a handful of people in her life, that I had somehow provided a safe space for her to express that. She trusted me with that truth, the love she had for a person who had done such horrible things. We sat in a place of simultaneous impossible and possible. We loved the people that were the most hated, and we were both related to the hated, the offspring, the daughters. She and I both knew some things that never needed to be spoken. You have to think about the things you don't want to. You have to confront the things that are real and really do happen. You have to be the opposite of the denier. You have to imagine the person you love the most doing the worst thing ever. How you build after that makes all the difference. Even if she and I were to go to a cafe and give each other an hour of a soliloquy of our pain, we would have to come to the same conclusion, and we didn't even need to speak this. How did you do it? How did you heal? Day by day. What a boring and untriumphant answer. And yet it's the truth. No resurrection, no bells and whistles. The stories of coping often have no conclusion, just an inertia of management and distance. And in this case, both definitions of inertia work. There's never going to be a day where she and I would decide how we felt, and then those thoughts would be over and done with, and we would have our problems solved and guilt in existence, and we would go on to live happily ever after. Personal stories almost never end that way. However, we're programmed to think they do. And just for the record, I'm not against happy endings, but they have to be real and they have to have texture. They can't be artificial. That moment was so important to me. It affected me deeply, clearly, but it wasn't the one that kept nagging at me. It was the encounter with the woman who didn't want to hear my talk. She didn't want her world to get turned upside down into a place where she would have to negotiate uneven territory and possibly trip. She wanted to keep things the way they were. That woman wanted to shoo away all that texture and keep her puzzle pieces in a nice place, properly fit to a flat, matching surface that she could walk on. She didn't want to be confronted with my humanity, a humanity that exists despite the horror, a humanity spared because my father did not go to the electric chair, and quite frankly, also a humanity with a big mouth who is not going to shut up anytime soon. Maybe she didn't think she could hold her own human self in the midst of listening about human destruction. These are the ones who never want to ever have to think about children running through hallways and slipping on their classmates' blood as they try to escape the flying bullets. They don't want to have to think about the sounds of bodies falling on Walmart tile floors in El Paso, or the ringing of cell phones nonstop in Virginia Tech classrooms people calling the dead to find out if they're okay. They never want to ever have to think about if your father was touching the genitalia of children. Have you ever had to think that thought? Have you ever had to hear that story? Have you ever had to think about what it might be like to watch your father die on live television as he begged for his life, as George Floyd did? Have you ever had to hold love and hate at the exact same time? The marginalized are very adept at this. As I hugged the woman who faced these things, I also carried the thought of the woman who could not confront these things. Someone who could not see the world exactly as it is. She was literally recoiling from her own kind and the truth itself. If you do not hear the story, you cannot be part of the change. You've got to hear the truth of it. Why have we become so afraid when we already know the things that humans are capable of? My master's thesis showed that by listening, memorizing, and embedding stories of horror in the brain, it can create an instilled memory of sorts. To make a very long story short about my thesis, I proved that hearing Holocaust stories and remembering them makes you more likely to be an activist and change your behavior based on what you've learned. I showed that the campaign for Holocaust education so saturated our culture that there isn't a 10-year-old today in Western culture that doesn't know what the Holocaust is, and has had to, at least for a few minutes, had to sit with the very real truth that someone watched their family walk into a building and then come out the chimney. If 10-year-olds can handle this thought, we can sit and listen. We all have a memory of Auschwitz, even though we weren't there. This is the power of storytelling. Yet, because this horror, the Holocaust, is in the past, we tend to believe it's more palatable or not of our world currently. We somehow don't believe we're responsible for the Holocaust, so it tends to be a consumable horror. We have distance. And yet we avoid the horror happening every single day in our own cities. In creating memory through repetitive storytelling, we will never create the relived experience. And I want to be clear about that. We can't ever have the actuality. But collective memory has never been about an actuality of living the event. It's always been about the sharing of the memory and holding it in a culture. I was working at a minister's office in Harlem in 2002 when I was listening to a radio program about racial injustice. One African-American man spoke about his life and growing up in America. The moderator asked if or when he had experienced firsthand racism. He gave a few examples and then explained how it made him feel. And then he paused. You could hear him trying to fight back tears. And you know, on the radio, 15 seconds sounds like an hour. He finally was able to express this place that couldn't be expressed. And he said, all I need you to do is hear my pain. All I ask is that you listen to what I have to say about my experiences. And then he said again, I need you to hear my pain. His words settled into me and affected me deeply. If given the space, the safety, people will express exactly what they need to. If given the time, they will describe for you what their Saturday is like. The place and space before the glitter and gold, before what was dead can magically reappear again. Time and space go together. The key is you have to sit there with them and not beg for Sunday to roll around. Just listen, commit to memory their story. I thought also of Mr. Howard from my 8th grade history class who came to us to share about what it was like to live in the Jim Crow South. He gave this talk every year. And for whatever reason, this year, he had a much harder time. When he began, he talked about the difficulty. He talked about how awful it was. And then he spoke about the time when he saw the white bathroom labeled. And then he had to look around and find the colored bathroom and where that might be. The way his body was moving, you could tell he was reliving the moment as his head moved from side to side, indicating the decision he had to make. There was a pause, a moment of absorption in what this really meant. He looked up with tears in his eyes and promptly left the classroom. He waited outside for his horror to subside. He came back in, apologized. Now I see it as an apology from an adult to children for leaving them in a space of uncertainty. Any responsible adult would understand that. But now I see that that quite possibly was the lesson itself. I have never forgotten Mr. Howard's inability to express in words what dehumanization feels like. It more than likely feels very much like you want to walk out on it. I also have not forgotten my responsibility in listening to it. A week after George Floyd's death, I was watching the news. They were filming a confrontation between two Black men in the middle of a protest. One older, the other younger, and it seemed a father and son relationship. At first it appeared heated. It seemed like there was some kind of argument, but really as you watched it, it became more understanding that it was a passionate sort of standoff between two men, and it seemed to be father-son. And this man was pointing to his son, telling him what he needs to think about for his generation, reflecting to the crowd about what they see around them, that he needed to keep fighting, he needed to keep up with the work and not let it die. And then there was a strange pause. The father backed away from his son, put his head down in his hands, and all around grew quiet. And the older man began to cry. He came to his son and hugged him and said, "I need you to hear our pain." The space had come in, and it was made to deliver what needed to be heard. Enough time had been given for the truth to rise up, not to cover it up. We have to start treating the personal stories of people of color like the testimonies they are. And we have to be vigilant that their stories are exactly of the same fabric and importance as any other memory out there. And this goes also for the Me Too stories and those memories. In order for there not to be two separate collective memories, which is what we will have to adjust to how we listen so that we can merge our memories. And not just to listen to each other, but to memorize that memory and make it your own. Remember, it is in the repetition of the story and the transmitting of it through society that the healing begins. That is how a memory gets instilled. Listen, memorize, repeat, and transmit. That is the responsibility. So what in the world does all of this have to do with oneness, which is the title, right? Am I ever going to get there? Well, oneness is a fallacy. It doesn't exist. It's always been a fallacy. It's a hope that too often has been used to silence the people that need to say something about how not one we are. Requesting, praying for, saying oneness now is worse than spiritual bypassing. It's moving more into the realm of gaslighting. Saying it without hearing the stories is not going to allow for the texture that we need. Oneness has become the resurrection wipeout. The thing that says, it doesn't matter what happened, we're all the same. Oneness in this sense, ironically, doesn't accommodate the texture necessary to feel whole in the oneness. This kind of platitude oneness actually creates the divisiveness it's meant to heal, as one of my sweet friends has pointed out to me. As we are now, oneness needs to wait. It needs to sit in its own Saturday for a while. But this does not mean we don't find the things we have in common. Both of these things can be true. Texture, find the common, but honor the diversity. Separate is not always a bad word. And I know all the New Agers out there are cringing over this because their philosophy is that separateness is sin. I get that. But just hold on to that for a second. Being with yourself or your clan or your people or your group that helps you form your personal identity is what allows for you to keep your inner diversity so that you might then be able to withstand and embrace the world's diversity. Keep your inner diversity, the places in you that, yes, will be lived, but they may not ever be solved. And more importantly, they may not have words, but that doesn't mean you don't listen to them. The places in you that are textured, keep them. Their lack of conclusion may be your only navigational tool that you own to be able to sit and listen to the stories that are inevitably coming. So let's not think of the puzzles anymore that want to lie flat without any bumps. Nothing is going back to the way it was, because the way it was is why we are here. Throw out ideas of meshing the flushed edges and the perfectly fitting together. Humanity has never, ever been that way, and it's not going to start now. Any idea you have of perfection in the past you might have is by definition a fallacy. We have to start imagining for ourselves what looks more like a mosaic, the muck, the stuff that all those tiles sit in together. That's what we have in common. Our pieces, the jagged edges, the imperfect patterns, the necessary brokenness of that art form itself is what makes the whole. We can pull back and see the whole picture. And when we get close, we can realize the picture is made of broken pieces that don't ever match. And even worse, they're never going to touch each other. But they aren't supposed to. The space they hold in the muck matters a whole lot to the bigger picture. Let's be in that space where our differences can be jarring, but the muck we stand in is the same. Hearing the stories that inevitably will reveal our culpability. Being willing to feel accountable and loving at the same time. Grief-stricken and unsure without a way to solve it immediately. This is where we have to sit, in the diversity of the unknown. It is in this space that the memories get planted. In the darkness, the seed will split and begin to grow. That's how things grow. Darkness always comes first. There's no way around it. And this natural, amazing process will begin to unfold in our society. Our stories, finally the whole lot of them will be told. Be prepared to listen. It's going to take a lot longer than 3 days. And I assure you it's nothing that we can shoo away. Thank you very much for listening to me. I'm now going to share with you a video in which the things I've talked about organically get shown. You're going to see a video of James Corden talking about the death of George Floyd and the protests. And then you'll see the phenomena that I talk about. And then at the end, there's a musical performance that kind of drives home a lot of what's happening in our country. So it does take a little bit of time, but I assure you it's worth it. It's a very good video. Let me see if I've got it. Okay, can you hear me, everybody? All right. Q&A, just unmute yourself, whoever would like to ask a question, and no question is too difficult or inappropriate. I've been asked everything you can imagine, and every kind of tone you can imagine too, so go for it.
You can also type a question in the chat and I can moderate it if you're more comfortable doing that as well.
I'm looking over some of these. Okay. Pushing through for a happy ending. Okay. Well, that person signed off, but yeah. Pushing through to the happy ending causes us to rush through the experience and uncomfortable lessons that can aid in permanent healing. Yes, they got it. Good. And it's not unusual for people not to have questions because I tend to throw a lot out there, so. Anybody? Ava, you have a question?
Any questions or comments from anyone?
I do have a question. Okay. Do you ever find that you distinguish your feelings of love between people who do horrific things because they have a mental illness, like schizophrenia, bipolar illness, and they aren't in touch with reality at the time they commit the crime, versus those who just do horrific things because it's fun? like sociopaths who maybe want to string somebody up and beat up an Emmett Till, or send people to a gas chamber maybe? Do you think there's any distinction between the two?
Let me answer it this way. In some ways, there's no distinction between the two because they both come from the same society. So the ability to enable sociopaths to create gas chambers doesn't come from the sociopath. It comes from the society that allows that to happen. I mean, the bricklayers, even, to put it down, you know. Nothing exists in a vacuum. School shooters do not exist in a vacuum. Sociopaths that walk down streets with AR-15 killing innocent American citizens, as just happened 3 days ago, those don't exist in a vacuum. They exist because there are steps that enable that to happen. So this person is allowed to have a gun. And so because they might be a sociopath or mentally ill, that they're given that ability to do that. You know, when you said love, and I often think about, you know, of course, proximity to me, I'm going to love my father probably more than other people. But I mean, I have compassion for all involved. I have love for all involved. But the ability for a sociopath or a mentally ill person, and there's kind of one and the same sometimes, to commit a crime happens because society, not just because of the individual. Nobody wakes up independent from everybody else and just decides they're going to kill somebody. This happens over a long period of time of thinking about it. And if it doesn't happen over a long period of time, they're given the instruments for which to commit the crime because those things have been in place for a long time. Does that answer your question?
It does to some degree, but I still get confused when I see the police being told as individuals, well, we have to prosecute them as individuals, when you're telling me it's a society that is causing the problem rather than the individual. And to tell you the truth, I really do believe in the genetic predisposition to this. And I don't think you can escape your genes. I mean, I've worked in forensic psychiatry for many years, and yet I still struggle with it. I still struggle as to how to approach the problem. And I'm wondering if we should be approaching the police with love to those who do these horrific acts, as well as the victims. What is your take on that?
Well, training is huge. I know in Kansas City also funding is different. So Kansas City funding is different than, I'm in Kansas City. Kansas City funding is different than other funding. So we don't have the big army tanks and all that other kind of stuff because our funding is different. And because of that also, our funding goes to psychological training. I know a few Kansas City cops very closely, and they talk to me, but that their training is to talk down. Their training, and I'm not saying the Kansas City Police Department doesn't have any flaws, but they have the funding to get the training to learn how to deal with human beings and deal with mental illness. And many police departments don't have that funding to do that. They choose to spend their money on other things. So without learning how to de-escalate something, there's no opportunity for love. Without being trained in how to look at the person as a human being and look at the whole scope of the situation. So I think in one way of answering your question, it's not necessarily about teaching love, it's about teaching collective. It's about teaching community. It's about teaching that kind of, we're all sort of in this sort of thing together. You've got to see where, you know, the cop has to approach the person as seeing that they come from a whole background that's going on. The cop comes from a whole background that's going on. And then within the training of the cop determines sort of the outcome, I think, in many ways. Again, this is really a complex issue, but you know, your point about genes, I think is very true. Unfortunately, I think in our society now, if you're born with a gene that has a propensity for sociopathic tendencies, you're going to be fostered pretty well here. I think the lack of empathy and sociopathic tendencies has really taken over in our society. I just think it gets shown constantly. You know, I think that the look on the face of the man who killed George Floyd says it all, with his hand in his pocket. There was no reverence there. There was no pause, no light in the eye as what was happening. Yeah. I don't know if I can give you a totally satisfactory answer.
You did well. Thank you.
Anybody else?
I think that she brings up a good point in that as we continue to understand how the human consciousness works and the human behaviors are dependent on genetic causes and so forth, we're going to have a real difficult time figuring out justice
Mm-hmm.
And how we as a society can promote civility together.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a fact of the more we know, the more we're going to have more to deal with, the more we know.
Mm-hmm. Well, and the more we know in terms of personally, if I want to bring this back to the talk and say, the more we know of personal stories of horror, the better chance we have of absorbing and connecting that memory so that we don't end up not only harming others, but in turn then harming ourselves again over and over again as a society, because we don't know where the other is coming from. Tim Wise wrote an amazing article. I think it's called like, repetitive disorder. I think if you just look up something like repetitive syndrome disorder or something, and this was a few years ago during the Ferguson riots when he talked about how Jon Stewart calls riots in African American communities like a Halley's Comet. Basically, they come by, we see it, and then they go away, and we just wait for the next comet to come by, sort of. Tim Wise was saying that these things keep happening because we have two different tracks of history going. That when something happens in the African American community, the African Americans respond with a different function of history going on. The names of other people, the ways, I mean, the Tulsa riots is a good example, you know, a plethora of white people had only heard of the Tulsa riots, you know, recently, but this has been a part of the psyche for a long time in the African American community. So they're not only two different timelines, but two different memories. And the more those start to merge, and the only way to do that is to instill that memory from the past from other people, the better chance we have of creating the collective that can then be responsible for each other. Because right now we're talking two different countries pretty much. And the Holocaust campaign took a long time. It's not like it's going to take overnight, but in my thesis, what I proved was that you can't go 48 hours without seeing an allusion to the Holocaust, either on a show or a commercial or somewhere that you're reading or whatever it is. You are bombarded that you have been educated with this. And therefore, you have a memory of something you've never experienced only because you've been, sort of repetitively pounded with these stories. So that's what the level of which has to happen for the African American community, their stories to come into the fore and be confronted we have to confront those stories and absorb them and memorize them and pass them on. I always think the best way to start is with Sojourner Truth. If you look at, the narrative of Sojourner Truth and you memorize bits and pieces of that and then pass those on, you can also start there. I think it's very complicated for white people to demand that African Americans tell their stories. This has to happen organically. It's not something we can expect of them, certainly. It's not their job, but it's an inevitability, certainly. So I'm talking about it organically.
Looks like there's a question in the chat.
Oh.
From Desiree. Listen, did you want to read it or?
Sorry, given the role of colonialism in the US, how do you view this progression happening? We've lived side by side, even with segregation, in very intimate ways. Yet here we are with Black people getting gunned down, now for everyone to see. Yeah, it's this is a hard one. Listen, memorize, repeat. Well, I don't know that colonialism ended, first of all. I'm not sure that. I think it just kind of moved into different directions. Certainly the paperwork of racism is well documented, especially in communities like New York City, where they have the actual records of the move out and everything. I think there's a turning inside out that I'm sensing, in which the exposure of what really happened and the things that are shielded from white people are shielded from their own history because it's too intolerable, I think. So I think there are levels in which white people have to listen and sit with their own discomfort about their past, the truth of it, before they're even able to absorb the discomfort of what that past caused. And I think there's going to be a simultaneous, a little bit back and forth too. Is it Kimberly Jones? Was it Kimberly Jones, the one on the YouTube video that talked about the Monopoly game, and how she talked about how the social contract has been broken? I think it's through honesty like that and some pretty jarring rhetoric that white people can wake up, because you have to decolonize the conversation. And I'm sorry, I know her name is Kimberly, but I don't want to say her last name incorrectly. I'm saying Kimberly Jones. The way she was able, in a metaphor of Monopoly, to show how the economy happened toward African Americans, and she did it in less than 10 minutes. It was very jarring, and the language she used was very jarring, and the way in which she was honest with her feelings about it, her anger, her sacred anger about that, I think was a perfect example of what can happen when you decolonize the conversation and get very honest about what happened. White people have absolutely no concept about the economic structure that kept Black people from having any wealth. They don't understand the mechanism of it. So, you know, it's a little bit of white people learning their own discomfort of what happened in their past, and then learning the African American side of it. But again, that's really tricky. And Desiree, I know you, and that's a really, really, really good question. Do white people have the level of resilience necessary to confront stories where their heroes are clearly not the heroes? Short answer, no. The fragility of white people is astonishing, mostly because of the brainwashing of the American patriotic system. You know, we are, you know, patriotism in itself is brainwashing pretty much. And the perfect example of that is when I raised my hand in class and said, what about the Japanese lives, you know, for the atomic bomb? I don't understand. And they're like, no, we had to save American lives. And I couldn't understand how anybody could have a conversation and not, these are human beings we're talking about, right? So it's that brainwashing that happens in those classes. Less of it now than there used to be, certainly. I've just flipped through my daughter's US history textbook, and there's a whole thing on Andrew Jackson and the removal of Native Americans that did not exist in my textbook in history as a kid. I think mine said that they volunteered to move on. So I think the fragility of white people is a stumbling block. And I think in general, we have a very hard time listening to discomfort and sitting in it, which is why we don't solve our problems, right? We have such a hard time confronting our problems. In the book Sapiens, you know, Harari talks about our uncanny ability to not be able to solve the problems that we create. Even though we know, when we know they're problems, we have time to solve them, and we don't. We turn the other way. I think we have to decolonize listening. I think we have to decolonize storytelling itself and just be unabashed and unapologetic in how honest we are. It's that Hannah Gadsby moment where she says, I'm going to retell the story, but I'm going to say it exactly how it happened. That the man who made fun of me at the bus stop actually beat me so bloody I went to the hospital. And then when she originally tells the story, she tells it as a joke. And so when you learn the undergirding of how she got there, that's where we all have to be. And I think, let me say this, when white people confront their own pain inside, they're going to be better listeners. Nobody escapes suffering. Of course, we can get into comparative suffering if you want to, but white people themselves are going to have to go inward a little bit more to be able to listen openly. Oh, it is Kimberly Jones. Okay, good. So yes, Desiree, I think, you know, this is huge. We got to teach white people to listen, and to listen to horrible things, and it will take years. Really, really good point. Thank you.
No problem. And I wanted to say hi because I would have felt bad if I sat on mute the whole time. So hi.
Hi. Thank you. I know this isn't a pleasant subject. Anybody else have a question? And you can always email me. My email is carrahq@gmail.com, CARRAH. Let me put it in the chat box here. And you can email me anytime. I know the last time I gave this talk, it was just a lot of emails. People were, I mean, this was much closer to George Floyd's death the last time I gave this talk, and it was to a Canadian community that, you know, they were tender. Not saying you're not tender, but they were too emotional really to talk. So I understand if that's the case. So I'm happy to answer an email for sure. Will this talk be shareable?
Yes. So we did get flagged on Facebook for sharing the video, but I did pause the recording. So when we upload to YouTube, it should be fine. What shouldn't get taken down for copyright infringement. So I will send that out to everyone. It looks like another question might have just come through.
So thoughts on what are your thoughts on restorative justice in this context? I did my own restorative justice, unbeknownst to my father. I visited my father's victim's brother. That was interesting, helpful, healing, all good stuff. Thoughts on restorative justice. So I think if I were to have a grand plan of things, since you know, I sort of proved that storytelling can change things. I would love to see a national campaign, much like the Shoah Foundation for Steven Spielberg and the USC campus, where they collected all the stories. And this is different than slave narratives. I want to make that very clear. This is about the navigation of white supremacy and what that might be like. And again, it's that tension of asking African Americans to share again when it's not, this is not, they don't have to waste their time doing that, honestly. But the national campaign, just like the Shoah Foundation, to record the stories, to get them in a system that can be navigated and you know, accessed at any time, and also categorized. I certainly think African American women living in 1970s urban areas are going to have a different experience than African American women living in the 1940s in you know, rural areas, and those stories need to be shared as a whole, complete thing. So yeah, I see a restorative justice in the context of a larger audience of white people listening to stories of racism and white supremacy. That's helpful and it works. So I hope we can get there. In the context of restorative justice, in terms of this situation, we have to remember that the aim of restorative justice often is to find healing and peace. And in some ways, acknowledge redemption, forgiveness, things like that. I don't think that white culture is deserving of that at this time, the space for that. I don't know that anything can be restored to the extent collectively yet that we can speak of. Restorative justice tends to be very personal, very individual in scope, because it's usually victim and perpetrator meeting it one-on-one. If we're going to blow this up, I think we have to let go of any idea of some kind of redemption, forgiveness type of situation. This is not an opportunity for white people to feel absolved of anything. It's not an opportunity for white people to feel better. It's not an opportunity for white people to feel comforted in any way. So in the context of those definitions being the traditional definition of restorative justice, this is something different. But the conversation still has to happen, for sure. I hope that answered your question, Katie Ingalls.
Yes, it actually did very well. Thank you.
Good.
Do we have other questions or comments?
Yeah. Good one, Brad. Yes, restorative justice is effective in regard to a past event. Our problem is a continuing event. Very, very good. Very good.
Other questions or comments? Well, I do have a comment and a question. You mentioned the, understanding of the racial equity imbalance in terms of our monetary economic system. We actually did a racial wealth gap simulation at the Interfaith Center in last fall. And so anyone in Ohio, Hall Hunger of Dayton does this simulation, and they are more than welcome to bring it to your community or your congregation or whatever, faith community or non-faith community you occupy. And it's very well received, and it really breaks it down in a very visual, impactful way of how these policies were set in place to create the wealth divide. So I recommend that resource. My question is, I think in terms of interfaith spaces, we tend to routinely commit the fallacy of oneness. There's almost an impulse, I think, in interfaith communities to say we're all the same as a way to unify us a little more rapidly, I guess. But I think, to me personally, interfaith is more about highlighting our differences and welcoming those differences and sharing in them and learning from each other. So my question is, how can interfaith communities be more intentional in highlighting the diversity versus trying to create this solution that we are all homogenous when we're not? And as well as, how can we use interfaith platforms as a space for the type of storytelling that you are alluding to?
Okay, well, I'm going to get big on hermeneutics of suspicion here, because anytime I can use that term, I'm going to. So womanist theology, right? So Black feminist theology, womanist theology. Is it not here? We could go grab the book. Dolores Williams, Sisters in the Wilderness, right? Storytelling from the perspective of what's happening now can be found in scripture, but you have to sympathize with the character that gets ignored, right? Hagar. Okay, so is it okay that we have an entire 3 religions based on a patriarch that kicked a woman out of his front door who he got pregnant? What does that say? What story is that? And what religion gets formed from that patriarch? And I'm not talking about, like, people will say I use my cultural lens to come back on this. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that, can't we find in the African American community where that happens all the time? And is it in fact the influence of Abraham that allows that to happen? I mean, Dolores Williams, she's always saying, what about Hagar? What happened to her? And we don't care. So we have to be honest about the stories that exist in there and how those metaphors have embedded themselves in our present day society. When we look at the indigenous population of the United States, they fell victim to the Old Testament. They didn't fall victim to a bunch of white guys on horses. I mean, that may physically be what happened. What they fell victim to was verses of the Bible that said, go to the land of milk and honey and kill those Canaanites, every single one. Because that's how that was interpreted. Robert Allen Warrior wrote that article, Cowboys, Canaanites, and Indians, where he said, don't hold them responsible for their genocidal killing. They're just following their religion. So interfaith, and we could even go into the Quran, for goodness sakes, Interfaith has to be honest about the stories they hold, and I will always say they must remove themselves from that scripture. From bad text, you've got to divorce yourself from it. Don't accommodate it. Don't tell me it's a metaphor, because that doesn't work anymore, because we know that people live metaphors, and we only need to look around to see that that's happened. The Bible was used to justify slavery. The Bible's been used to justify genocide, sexism, and racism. And if you want to share those stories, then you have to be honest about them. So that's that first one. The other one, remind me your first question, because I really got hooked into that one. Interfaith and something else.
About, maybe the part about how we tend to try to homogenize all of the religions rather than celebrating the diversity.
I don't know that we do. I mean, can you imagine a white Baptist preacher feeling brotherly love for an African-American Baptist preacher? I mean, I don't see the unity very much at all. I don't. And Muhammad Ali said that all the time, that he couldn't go into a church as a Christian anywhere. He could only go to a Black church. That Christianity did not homogenize anything. Christianity actually doubled down on its whiteness in some ways. So the homogenization doesn't work for me in Christianity. I don't think it ever existed. I think they aim for it all the time. But
right.
Again,
I mean more in just like in an interfaith type of
Interfaith
environment
context, when we
where
sit
you're
and pray, yeah, we hold hands and we
Yeah.
talk about kumbaya and everything's fine. You know, I can't discount those moments. I mean, I've seen good facilitators really engage that. I've seen Matthew Fox do it. I've seen TD Jakes do it. I've seen, you know, a really good evangelical preacher can do it for sure. I've seen pagan priestesses hold space and create a oneness. I'm not saying it can't happen, but I think it can't happen at the expense that the injustice is overlooked. It's got to be kept in the balance, and you can't rush it. You know, right now in this country, we should not be holding hands saying kumbaya. It just isn't. It's so affronting. We've got to be able to recognize the difference and see the pain. We've got to be able to be realistic and honest about what's happened and what's happening, and that what's happening is because of what's happened, that nothing ever ended or stopped. Yeah, I'm nervous about oneness, you know, but the little hippie in me, I mean, she wants it still. I do. And it is possible, but it's got to be, again, we have to be careful about feeling that story, feeling that time and space distance. 3 days isn't long enough. So, you know, if I was going to put the context of the resurrection somewhere, it might be 10 years from that Good Friday to really sink in and feel and understand, you know. I think when it's appropriate, when it's felt, you know, the space when it's appropriate, you know, and maybe we need to be better about that compass. I know in the past, white people have forced it because it makes them feel better, right? Oneness kind of substitutes for some kind of like, we're forgiven, right? You know, we have to be really careful that oneness is not gaslighting. I know that sounds like a bummer. Anybody else? Okay. Don't hesitate to contact me.
Any other questions or comments? Last chance. I know we're about 1:15 now, so. Oh, we have someone in the waiting room. Maybe she has a question.
Carrah, do you think there's a way to initiate or have the conversation with someone who seems to constantly victim blame in the situations that we've seen recently with Black America? Or is it one of those that they're not going to be open to the conversation until they're ready for it?
Well, they're not going to be open to the conversation until it affects them. That's the trajectory of gay marriage. That's how we saw that happen. Until it affected enough people that were against it, and they had to not turn their eyes or their hearts on their own relatives, you know. The more we integrate rather than segregate, the better chance we have of exposing people's undergirded, you know, existence a little bit. The victim blaming is, it's a reinforcement of status, you know, it really is. It's that, if you're reading caste or not, I don't know, but it's just a lot of how white people operate in terms of the system is to just reinstate their status in caste. So I will blame the victim. If I know, then it's going to make me sit prettier knowing that I had nothing to do with this. I had nothing to do with what happened to Jacob Blake. It's Jacob Blake, right? Jacob Black? Jacob Blake. I can't remember now. Blake, yeah.
Correct.
So, you know, blaming Jacob Blake because he had a domestic violence dispute or whatever, and saying that, you know, it's that whole thing of looking for the past criminality to feel good about the justification for the violence against the person in the present. Again, that is another status holding. Again, we have to be willing to give up our status if we're going to give up victim blaming. All victim blaming is a reinforcement of status. And wow, I mean, we could get an even, giving up status means you give up power, and then that's a whole other, yeah, I don't know if I'm answering your question. That's a really big one.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, the short summary is good.
Yeah, you have to know the undergirdings of a person's life to stop the victim blaming. You have to know where they came from and why. If anybody remembers Reginald Denny, anybody remember Reginald Denny from the LA riots, the trucker that was beat up and almost killed? In his, he forgave all of those people. And in his statement, he said, I understand why, I understand where they come from, I understand why they did it and what's happening, and I do not hold them accountable. And I think, we could all ask everybody be like Reginald Denny, but my point is that he was able to connect the dots, that he ended up in the middle of an intersection on a day, a really bad day, or a day of vocalization, really, the anger over the Rodney King trial. So, he was able to see the story. And I think if I've always fantasized about like the Reginald Denny Center for, understanding and forgiveness. But, he's just a perfect example of someone who could see the before. And here, let me say this too. We don't teach storytelling. So we don't teach about what happens before is what creates the character plot line of what we're reading about as it goes. Again, our expositions are shorter. Sometimes even the rising action is shorter. We're really high on resolution and climax. That's all we want is the ending and the climax, give it to us. But exposition, as it gets shorter in our movies, in our songs even, and our books, we're losing the ability to understand the before story. So, I mean, as an activist storyteller, I'll tell you that part of the reason why we can't ever identify with the victim is we don't know how to even go create the story itself. Does that make sense? Yes.
Yes,
No?
absolutely.
Okay, good. All right.
Were there any other final questions or comments?
Are you calling it, Eva?
Trying to read the room, so it's hard. A lot of people aren't on camera, so. No more questions? Okay. Well, you all have her email address, and it sounds like she's very willing to respond. So I hope you'll write that down. I put it in the chat again. So I just want to thank all of you for joining us tonight, and thank you to Carrah for helping us facilitate this challenging conversation and for sharing your wisdom and insight. And I will send out the recording if anybody would like to share it or rewatch it and come back to questions later and send her an email. So look for that. And I hope that you all join us for future upcoming programs with the Interfaith Center. And I will send out the links to all of your speaking engagements. You have a website and stuff. So if anyone wants to follow you, they can do that as well. So thank you all so much for your time. And did you want to leave any closing
Just stay uncomfortable. Stay uncomfortable. Stay in the thick of it. We're all in this together, literally. I mean, there's just no other way to get through this, to witness and see, to absorb, to listen and stay uncomfortable. And if it gets too difficult, reach out to somebody,
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Yeah. I hope you all have a great night.